right, so this is the Why is Agile Failing in Large Enterprises talk. I know that this particular room is kind of far away from the main room, so I'm sure people will be filing in as we go. That's all right. Got no problem with that. And if I go the down arrow instead of the up arrow, it actually works. All right, so I'm Andrew Fuqua. I've been in Atlanta, raised in Smyrna, lived in a couple of other places, but spent most of my life around here, and now live in Sandy Springs. My first programming job for money was Foxbase Pro. It was a bookkeeping application, and it was really a very agile approach, our agile project. I built a little bit, I showed it to the stakeholder, built a little bit more, got some feedback, tested it. Of course, we didn't know the word agile then. We didn't use that. It was before that was coined. But very adaptive. Found out that the person who was paying the check wasn't really the end user, so I started talking to the end user, figured out what their job was, and went from there. So after that, in '89, I joined up with IBM in Research Triangle Park, and I was working on communications controllers, bigger things. I helped develop their first router. So lots of, imagine lots of people. Imagine the test floor was a whole floor of a high-rise building, and it had lots of green screens. And we ran our communications controller driving these screens, and they would just sit there and they'd all flash through the automated test that we ran. So big programs, big projects, project management offices, some amount of waterfall, plan-driven approach. If you've read Fred Brooks's Mythical Man Month, he talks about a chief programmer model in there. It was that kind of approach. So that was definitely not so agile. Big, releases that took many months to build out. I found myself in '96 managing a couple of teams of Smalltalk programmers. And if you know anything about Smalltalk programmers, they're very agile. They take pride in craftsmanship, and it's the community from which extreme programming came out of. Of course, in '96, we still didn't know the term agile, and Scrum was just starting to be codified and talked about, and the XP book, Extreme Programming book, would come out in '99, I think, or thereabouts. So that team was very much kind of a pre-agile, very big on craftsmanship. Of course, we were still in IBM, and we were building a configuration program for some communication switch or many of the pieces of networking equipment in there. But we had a couple of relatively small agile teams, and you can imagine the cultural difference there between our team and the rest of the organization. And we wanted to do things in small increments and adapt and figure some things out as we go and be very agile and adaptive. But these large programs didn't value that, didn't want to work that way. And there was certainly an impedance mismatch, I guess you could say, between what we were trying to do, how we were trying to operate, and the rest of the organization. So, what was my first job as a manager, and I, didn't have a book to tell me how to be an agile manager, or even a manager for that matter. And so, to manage the project, what did I do? Well, I looked around and figured out what all the other managers and project managers did, which was use Microsoft Project. So I dutifully got out Microsoft Project and put together the project plan. And actually, there were some good points about that, which maybe I'll get to a little bit later. But I certainly mismanaged the project, and knew that there was the mismatch, but didn't know what to do about it. So that's kind of when I went on my journey to figure out better ways to manage projects. And I studied rapid development and debugging the development process, and then I lucked out, was able to get into some extreme programming teams in '99 over at Internet Security Systems, and worked in a number of different roles there, and figured out how to make small team Agile really work. And I was a founding member of the Agile Atlanta user group, and was a regular there and hosted it at my company. And I kind of became to be known as a guy who knows how to make Agile work. And people started asking me stuff, and I'd go spend time helping people out, answering their questions. Then, job change, I go somewhere else, do a couple more roles. So that 99 to 2009 was working at various roles in extreme programming teams, different sizes of companies. Then early 2010, I went out consulting, and I said, well, people tend to value what I had to say, so let's give it a shot. And then I discovered that, I've found myself back in big companies again. And I started working on this problem of how do you solve Agile? How do you do Agile in an organization that's not? How do you make it work? How do you transform a company? And so that's my background and where I'm coming from. And so for the last 5 years, I've been working on applying these concepts and figuring out how to make it work in larger companies. So that's my bias, and that's where I come from, and that's what forms my opinions. So feel free to, my Twitter is Andrew M. Fuqua, and it's not on there, but you can tweet Leading Agile or Andrew M. Fuqua. I'd love for you to connect to me on LinkedIn, and that's the company I work for, Leading Agile. So why does Agile work? When it does work, what makes it work? Well, I think that if we kind of boiled Agile down, or boiled Scrum down to its basics, its most basic form, we've got some kind of a backlog of user stories or whatever you want to call them, but there's some amount of work, and we have some team that can do that work. It's a cross-functional team, and at the end of every sprint, they have some measurable progress. Can you agree with me on that? Is that, the most basic of Agile? We got a backlog, we got a team, and we've got to get to measurable progress every sprint. Okay, good. So what I believe makes this work is that we've got extreme clarity in our backlog. We've got good stories, no ambiguity, good acceptance criteria. We've got a product owner or a product owner team that represents the stakeholders with one voice, and we have no ambiguity in our backlog. And this backlog is what drives what needs to be done, the work that the team needs to do. And when Agile works, it's because we have a small cross-functional Agile team that can do the work that's in the backlog. They can get it done. They don't have too many dependencies on other groups, and they can hold themselves accountable to meeting their sprint commitment. They have what they need, and they can have potentially shippable software or measurable progress every sprint. When we have these things, Agile tends to work, or it tends to work better. And a key point or a key enabler of that is a small co-located team with an on-site customer or an on-site product owner, someone who can help explain the clarity and test the measurable progress and look at the feedback and give feedback to the team. But it doesn't always work, right? I guess if you're in here, you've probably been in a failed Scrum implementation before, right? Can anybody been in a failed Agile didn't go so well for me? Yeah, lots of hands in the room. So I contend that when Agile fails, the first cause, the most direct cause, is that, well, we don't have clarity in the backlog, or we have little accountability in the team. The teams have too many dependencies. They can't get to done. They don't have all the people they need. The people are shared amongst multiple teams, or people are moved around between teams, things like that. So they don't have accountability. They can't get to done, and we can't measure progress, and we can't give feedback. So those are the most direct causes that I would argue cause Agile to not work. But these aren't necessarily the root causes. There's stuff in the organization that keeps us from having clarity and accountability and measurable progress. You know, it's sometimes for some teams, well, maybe we just need a little training or coaching. Maybe we need to write better acceptance criteria. Maybe, you know, if there's a little coaching or some improvement that the team itself can do, the delivery team itself can do to improve the situation. But not always. A lot of times there are organizational problems that get in the way. So think about the organizations that you've been in and what types of problems or difficulties can you think of that would keep us from having Agile work like it's supposed to? Just shout them out. What do you think?
Lack of being dedicated to this job. So amorphous resources.
Amorphous resources, people being moved around.
Lack of business accountability.
Lack of business accountability. Like what?
It's hard to get clarity when you have no business owners who are present.
Lack of business owners, or the inability of business owners to speak with one voice, or even more directly, business owners who are stakeholders in the business who give conflicting opinions on the approach. Yeah, what else?
Dependency on non-agile teams.
Dependencies on non-agile teams. Dependencies on other teams. Yes. In the red?
Lack of project vision and scope.
A lack of project vision and scope. Yes, right.
Waterfall expectations, commitments up front.
Yeah, waterfall expectations, commitments up front. Okay. I'm going to have to actually talk a lot about that. So things that get in the way. So all of those are great. This is my list. It's not a definitive list. It's not the best list. It's just a list. It's, my list. You certainly can add your own things to it, but I think of these things like matrixed organizations. When you do matrix management, often it's geared around utilization and efficiency. It's not, we're trying to squeeze the most that we can out of every developer, and so that we have no developers ever sit idle, and it loses focus of value delivery. And we tend to end up with too much work in process. We start projects because we have, this guy's got a quarter of availability, he's not fully used, and this guy's got a quarter of his time free, so he's not fully used, and this guy's not fully used, so and that guy's not fully used. Oh, we have a whole person, let's start another project, kind of thinking. So we end up with too much stuff going on. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that you need to stop matrix management. But if you do matrix management, you need to make sure that the product side of the matrix is the strong side, not the functional manager side. What I mean by that is that you want to focus on value delivery and keep teams together focused on value delivery, not focused on efficiency of every individual programmer. So things like large projects with diverse technology. So I would imagine a lot of you folks, you've probably got a database, you've got some legacy COBOL, you've got some Java in the back end, you've got a web front end, you've probably got a green screen terminal, and maybe there's some screen scraping or emulation stuff. Thank you, I don't need it anymore. I appreciate it though. I had asked for some flip chart paper earlier. I was going to write down the problems that you guys mentioned. I was going to write down my Twitter handle, but anyway. So okay, so where was I? So we were talking about diverse technologies, big companies. And you might have SAP or SAS or Salesforce integrations. You got all this stuff, diverse technologies to pull together. And it's incredibly difficult to, Scrum advice and the Agile advice is you have a cross-functional team, and you have a team that can do everything from soup to nuts. Well, that's not realistic in these large enterprises. You're just not going to have your COBOL programmers and your Java. I mean, you can retrain people to learn Java, sure, but you know, who in here wants to stop doing Java and go learn COBOL to support those systems? Not a single hand, right? Okay, and the Salesforce integrations, and that's specialized skills. So we're not going to be able to put together the core Scrum advice of a Scrum team that can do all of that. So that makes Agile hard. Non-instantly available resources and limited access to subject matter experts. If you've got 120 developers, you got several teams, and you got 2 DBAs that are supporting all of that, they're just not going to be instantly available to a team. Their priorities are going to be different than your priorities. And that's going to make that team be unable to get measurable progress at the end of the sprint. They're not going to be able to get done. If they need the DBA to do something, the DBA's got other priorities. So that's a difficulty. Technical debt and defects, certainly that gums up the works. If you need to demonstrate working software every 2 sprints or every 2 weeks, and you've got technical debt and defects, and you can't get the software to work in 2 weeks, well, that's a problem. Low cohesion and tight coupling. Yeah, I'm applying this concept to organizations. If you think about it, if you have an organization where you've got lots of some individual people and specialized skills, and you've got a bunch of teams of component teams, and everybody depends on everybody else, and you can't get anything done unless the whole organization moves in lockstep, and because you've got so many dependencies, then you've got really tight coupling. And we don't like tight coupling in our software architectures. Well, tight coupling in our organizations likewise create problems. All these dependencies create problems. So again, we could talk for a long time about things in the organization that keep us from being able to have Agile success. And of the stuff on this slide, about the only thing that's within the control of the team is maybe the technical debt and defects. And there are some organizational things even there that can keep the team from being from resolving that on their own. All right, so if I've described a problem, if I've described lots of organizational problems that will keep us from being Agile, well then how in the world could you begin an Agile transformation? Okay, so that's the bulk of this talk, and it's going to take a couple of different topics that I've got to go to kind of roll out this thinking. So remember the goal. We want to have clarity, we want to have accountability, and we want to have measurable progress. Clarity in our backlog and be able to get working software every 2 weeks. So if that's our goal, if that's what we need to get to, and we need to set up the organization so that teams can deliver that, then I would say that we need to consider, keep that in mind as we consider the popular approaches to Agile transformation. So there's 3 popular approaches or places to start. One of them is culture, another is practices, and another is structure. So by culture, I mean, let's change our culture from being one of stodgy to being one of an Agile culture. And practices would be, let's teach Scrum, and let's teach extreme programming and pair programming and test-driven development. And structure is not talked about that much, but it's forming teams. And I have specific types of teams that I have in mind that I'm going to talk about. So let's consider each of these perspectives. They're all really essential. I mean, yet culture is huge. If you have a non-Agile culture and try to do an Agile transformation, you're going to struggle, right? So culture is very important, and you got to do the practices. The practices are important. If you don't do the practices, well, that makes it more difficult. So they're all essential. Not many people talk about structure, but so where would you start? Well, the culture first transformation is focused on changing hearts and minds. It's a belief that, if we can just get people to think Agile, to feel it, then we can figure out a process. The process will come. And it's focused on being Agile rather than doing Agile. It's focused on the values and the principles. You might have people come in and talk a lot about the Agile Manifesto and the belief systems and the principles and things like that. It's a belief that the delivery system, a good delivery system, will emerge or fix itself based on new thinking. Well, but what if it doesn't? It doesn't always, in my experience. Changing the culture is really, really hard. It's possibly the hardest thing to change, and it takes the longest. And even if you could change the culture, what if the organizational problems don't fix themselves? What if good practices don't emerge based on new thinking? It's Bill Wilson. I had to look at his name in my notes. Is the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he says let me get the quote right. You can't think your way into right action, but you can act your way into right thinking. So that means don't try to change your thinking. Just start putting in habits and practices. And your thinking will tend to follow. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think we can apply it to organizational agile transformation. So let's think about the practices first approach then. So the practices approach is focused on the things that you do, the roles, the ceremonies, the artifacts of Scrum. And by the way, I am going to make these slides available, and there's even a version of this deck on leadingagile.com that you can download. But at the end of the talk, I'm going to hand the slides over, so you'll have access to them. So this is focus practices first. Transformation is like, well, let's bring in a trainer. Let's train people on Scrum and tell them what they're supposed to do, and say, okay, go do Scrum, go do Agile. And it can be management driven. You can have management say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to bring in the training, and whether you wanted to do this or not, management can drive it. You can also do it kind of grassroots. Sometimes in some companies, teams can have enough freedom and autonomy to try it on their own, to pick up Scrum and go with it and give it a try. And so it's a belief that Agile is a process or a way to work. But what if the org structure won't let you do the practices? Often that is the case. The organization won't let you adopt Agile, or they put roadblocks in the way and they make it difficult. In fact, it's just not safe for many managers to try the Agile approach. They've got commitments and there's deadlines and going way out into the future, and you want to go to them and say, hey, well, we need what'll fix our problems is just being Agile. What we need to do is work in 2-week increments, and when we learn new things, we'll adapt to the plan. We can change direction. It's wonderful, right? Well, that doesn't sell to the manager who's got commitments all the way up the organization. They're making commitments to their customers. They're making commitments internally. So that kind of approach isn't a very good sell. And so they're being held accountable, and they don't know how to do Agile, or they don't know how to do Agile with all of the organizational problems that we mentioned earlier. You can also practice Scrum and have it not work. I kind of asked this earlier. A lot of people raised your hands. You've tried Scrum. You tried to do the practices, and it didn't work. So that's not always the place to start. So here's the third approach that's not talked about very much. It's the structure. And the structure approach is where you're focused on forming teams and governing the flow of value. And by teams, I'm going to give you a bigger definition earlier, but I'm talking about delivery teams as well as product owner teams and portfolio teams. Top to bottom, governing the flow of value and the flow of information through the organization. And so this structure first approach is focused on aligning the organization first. It's focused on fixing some of those problems first, before working on practices and culture. It's a belief that agile culture and practices only emerge within a rational structure and delivery framework. And so I've found this approach to be most successful with my clients. It certainly has to be a tight loop. So we can fix part of the structure, we can fix some of the organizations, immediately put in place practices and demonstrate some quick wins and start to build trust while working on the culture, which takes the longest to change. And it's a really tight loop, and it's an iterative and incremental approach that you have to take. So let's fix some of the problems, let's fix some of the structure, let's demonstrate success, and let's build trust, and then let's iterate. Then let's fix another problem and expand the transformation through some more parts of the organization. All right, so here's my working hypothesis. In fact, I've got 3. So if you're with me so far, I'm saying that healthy culture and effective practices only emerge within a rational delivery framework, and therefore successful agile transformation begins by defining a rational system of delivery for the enterprise. So we need, and by rational system of delivery, what I'm talking about is an organization that makes sense. An organization without certain problems, or with certain problems not being as bad as they are today. And then the third hypothesis is true agility requires breaking dependencies across the entire organization. Earlier I alluded to this tight coupling in the organization. All the teams are very tightly coupled in a lot of your organizations, and there's lots and lots of dependencies in the code and amongst teams, and it's really hard to move the organization with that type of these dependencies. So getting to true agility requires breaking a lot of these dependencies. Okay, so then let's talk now for a minute about organizations. Before I go on to the next step, I have to take a little detour here and think about what the organization values and how it's managed, as well as the market forces that are coming at the organization. So if you think about the organization or a team or a company, or even particular peoples in the company, they may be somewhere on this continuum in terms of what they value, what they're geared for, what they're built around. So some companies are built around predictability, making promises. We've committed that in 18 months we're going to deliver the such and such function to this major important customer, right? And others are value adaptability. And it's not a either or, that you can be somewhere on this continuum. You need some amount of adaptability in your companies, but you still need to make some commitments. You need to make some promises. So companies tend to just, and you can notice this desire for predictability in things like they have a PMO, they have a project management office, they have roadmaps, they've made commitments 6 months out into the future. You hear about deadlines and commitments a lot. So those are some keys. Often companies want both, and that's not as irrational as it sounds. Certainly for certain features or in certain areas of the product or certain product lines, maybe we need to make some commitments, but some other things we can leave flexible. Maybe we reserve some amount of our capacity or bandwidth for adaptability. And maybe certain aspects of the organization can be more adaptable and others have to be more predictable. So you can probably imagine where you are or where your company is on this line. Now let me think about another dimension for a moment, this convergent emergent dimension. Emergent is like, does anybody in here work for Turner? So yeah, so, okay, this is a couple. So what does Turner sell? What's their business model? What's it about? It's a media company, right? And what you're really after is selling advertisement. Maybe you sell the media to some people, but ultimately it's about advertisement. So they could build whatever they wanted as long as it sells advertisement. So maybe there's a group inside Turner, and I've not worked for Turner, so I don't know. I'm just imagining, because I drive down 400 or 85 or whatever it is, and I see them. They're building all the different web properties they've got. They've got NBA.com and this and CNN and that and the other and lots of different stuff. And so somebody in there, a product manager, may say, hey, there's an untapped market. There's the people are in this age group, and they like rock climbing and what's that when you wear a wingsuit sailing, and that's an untapped market. And so they may think that maybe they need some kind of a website related to those two things. And they could get into it, start doing some research, figuring things out, and determine, really what would get the most sales and extract the most money out of this market. Maybe it's not about those activities, maybe it's about the particular type of music that's attractive to them. So they could get in there and adapt. They could pivot. And of course, I'm making all this up because I don't work for Turner. But this does happen for certain companies. Google comes to mind. They could build Android, or they could build a search engine, or they could build devices, or they could build this or that or the other. It doesn't really matter as long as it's moving data and bringing money into the company. So the picture I'm trying to paint is that what they need to build can emerge as they get into it. They can start working on it and figure it out as they go. So that's not every company, though. A lot of companies know what they need to build. They've got commitments around it, and they need to build it by a certain date. And they need to converge on a solution. And the Convergent company or group or organization or team is more about reducing risk and getting everybody on the same page, reducing uncertainty, and delivering on whatever commitments they have to make. So you may be somewhere on that continuum as well. Right? So we can kind of think of these as quadrants, and I've named them the predictability convergent quadrant, and we have the adaptability convergent quadrant, and the adaptability emergent quadrant, and then this other one as well. So if we think about these quadrants, you might have thought that, well, that thing that you were saying about emergent, coming in every day, figuring out what you're going to build, being very adaptive, that's agile, right? Well, maybe, but really that's more like lean startup. We've got hypotheses to test. We're going to test these hypotheses, and we're going to what we need to build is going to emerge as we test these hypotheses. Really, agile, I like to think of it more in this quadrant, this adaptability convergent quadrant. If you take a look at the like the original extreme programming books that came out in the late 90s, they talked about things like release planning. They talked about things like writing a backlog of stories in advance and estimating them, not so that you know how many points to add to your sprint, but so that you know how many points to add to your release, or so that you know when you're going to run out of time, so that in advance you know what you need to do, how you need to trim scopes, so that you have time to plan and meet your commitments. So really, Agile is still about meeting commitments. We don't really think about it that way. We focus more on its adaptability, but really it's geared around and it's intended for helping us make and meet commitments on multiple scales. At the sprint, we need to make good sprint commitments, and we need to get to the end of our sprint and finish it cleanly. And the same with our releases as well. So it provides a lot of support for this. We know what we need to build, but we've got commitments around it, but we need to reduce risk and uncertainty to meet our commitments. So Agile is a wonderful tool for that. Agile is also a wonderful tool if you're in this lean startup approach. But I didn't want anybody to think that, well, Agile is just adaptability. It's certainly a wonderful tool to help us get where we need to be and meet our plans. All right, so then if you think about this predictability convergent quadrant, what immediately comes to mind is, well, we need predictability. We know what we need to build 6 months from now. We've got a date. Scope is fixed. Time is fixed. You kind of immediately start thinking traditional types of development. So who feels that their company either wants to be or is in this bottom left quadrant? They need to be predictable. Okay, you raise your hands high, and we know what we need to build. So maybe about less than half the room. All right. So yeah, that's a lot of you do have to deal with commitments and this space and predictability. Well, so if those quadrants exist, what about this one? This top left quadrant, predictability emergent. This is where we value predictability. We've got the PMO. We've made commitments, but requirements are changing all the time. So there's a real mismatch there, and there's a real struggle. And what typically happens is that we throw the process out the window, we throw the roadmap out the window, and we may throw the process out the window and start doing a more ad hoc approach. It's kind of an irrational place to be. It's a very uncomfortable place to be, and you find yourself being very reactive in that kind of environment. You're hampered by lots of dependencies. There's lots of expediting, resource shifting, multitasking, missed dates and surprises, and heavy change control. So that's not really a fun place. So you're sitting there and you say, well, Agile will solve our problem. If the requirements are changing all the time, well, we need to be more agile, right? It makes sense. It's a hard argument to argue against. So we're here. Here's our line of business. We've got all these problems, and so we need to move over. We need to shift to the right and move over to that quadrant is the thinking. Well, the problem, though, is that the organization still has all those problems, and they still have the commitments, and they still value predictability. So that moving in that direction doesn't work. As I mentioned earlier, you've got managers with commitments and all these organizational problems, and they don't know how to manage in that quadrant, and they're still held accountable for all the commitments. And the commitments don't go away. So that doesn't really work. All right, so suppose we're here. So maybe instead of moving to the right, directly, moving the whole organization, let's do an Agile Pilot. It does make sense to do an Agile Pilot. And when you do an Agile Pilot, what do? You don't want to set it up for failure. You want to set it up for success. So maybe you give them a new project, maybe a greenfield project. You suspend some of the heavyweight PMO. You suspend some of the process. Maybe it's in a place where they can explore the solution space a little bit. And so they're given some freedom, and so the pilot works. Maybe it didn't have as many dependencies as all the other teams. So we learned a lot, and so it was valuable to do the pilot. And then we try to move that team back into the rest of the processes and under the control of the PMO again, move it back into the rest of the organization, and it croaks under the weight of all the organizational problems. Or maybe we leave the pilot there in that quadrant because maybe it can continue to operate kind of independently, but we try to convert the organization over to Agile based on what we learned, but we don't solve the organizational problems, so that approach doesn't work. It's a clash of culture, too many dependencies, and we still have to make commitments. So, we're still here, and we're trying to move somewhere. So what if we move down into this predictive convergent quadrant? And let's just get predictable. Let's just get to the point where we can make and meet sprint commitments. Let's just figure out how to meet a commitment. And maybe we don't use, and instead of using traditional approaches, let's use lean and agile approaches. There's still some traditional stuff that's still in the organization. There's still some traditional stuff that we still need, but we can start introducing lean and agile principles and approaches, and it gives us the ability to start having conversations around what it means to be lean and agile. And we can start having conversations about the problems that we're having, and we can start tackling some of them. We can form good agile teams. When I'm saying that we need to do a structure first approach to the transformation. So the first thing we need to do is put some certain types of teams in place that will help Agile be more successful. And we want to put teams in place that are going to be focused around solving business problems. We need to align the people and the technology around solving business problems instead of aligning people around technologies. So in this kind of environment, we still have some heavy planning and control that we're going to have to do. We've still got all the dependencies, so we need to do a lot of dependency management. We need to do good risk management. We need to pull risk forward and resolve risks early. You still need project managers and PMO, and we still need road mapping and lots of planning constructs. And we're going to have to estimate our projects further in advance than we'd like to. And it's not going to feel very agile if you still got to make a 6-month commitment. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to identify your stories. If you're going to make a reasonable commitment, you have to know what you're going to build. Now, and you need to be able to estimate those early and quickly and far in advance and be able to revise your plan as you go. But again, it's not going to feel very agile. But these heavyweight things that we're going to need keeps the organization together while we transform it, because the organization still has to continue to deliver value, and we're changing things while work is in flight. We can't just throw up our hands and say we're going to do everything agile now. We got to have a journey, an approach to go. So it gives us the ability to put practices in place and start working on the culture, and we can have stable teams and more frequent testing, and then go from there. So if we can survive in this quadrant, if we can become predictable, if we can fix the organizational problems, fix the organizational structure, then we can start moving to the right. Then we can start once we've built trust and we say we can deliver, we don't have to make commitments 18 months in advance. We can reduce the batch size of our release. We can increase how often we release, and smaller batches, more automation, maybe do more. We'll have to do more services-oriented architectures. We'll have to put in DevOps and more automated testing, cycle time reduction, and then you can start sequencing the work to give yourself options and be more adaptable. So once you can fix some of these problems, then you can move over to the right. And then finally you can decouple teams and move up into that top right quadrant if you need to, and a lot of companies don't need to. But in this top right quadrant, you're focused on business outcomes and exploring the space and rapid adapting and small economic wins and tests, very independent teams. But again, most groups don't need to go that far. Now, of course, what I drew on that slide was, I'll come right back to you, was a line of business moving through that process. I didn't represent the whole company moving through that process simultaneously, and I started the conversation saying, well, let's just take one line of business, one group, one part of the organization, and let's just fix that one thing and get them predictable, delivering on their commitments, and learn how to do this and understand lean and agile, and then we'll pick up another piece of the organization and start working on that as the first piece of the organization maybe starts to shift to the right. Yes, a question?
Can you go back to the slide?
Yes.
So when you move from ad hoc to predictable, become predictable, and move from there to the reduced batch size, the predictability will shift that point of time?
Well, there's certainly a trade-off there. The more adaptable you are, the less predictable you can be, right? So, and the more predictable you need to be, the less you can adapt. It's a absolute trade-off. There's certainly a contention there. But it depends on what the business needs, how far you can shift. Your business might not need to go any further than here. You may be happy here. Maybe you want to shift a little bit to the right.
So we need to strike a balance most probably.
It's absolutely a balance, and you have to decide what the organization is ready for. But one of the points that I kind of glossed over is that if you can move from this low trust environment to becoming predictable and demonstrate trust, many organizations can then find that if they're meeting their commitments, the reason why they're making commitments so far out is to try to align all the dependencies and move this whole organization together in lockstep, and they can't release very often, and they have quality problems. So having more frequent releases is painful, and nobody trusts that. But once you start to become predictable, then you find that maybe we don't have to make commitments 18 months out. The customers can trust us to build the next most highest priority features, and maybe we can reduce that and start making commitments 6 months out. And then maybe we can reduce it and start making commitments 4 months out, because we've built that kind of a trust and predictability in the organization and with our customers. But again, that's a side benefit. It's not the focus of the point I'm trying to bring. So, we say we need to build our software in an iterative and incremental fashion. Well, we need to take an iterative and incremental fashion, our iterative and incremental approach to our organizational agile adoption or agile transformation as well. So suppose we start here, and that's the focus of this next few slides, is this iterative and incremental approach. Maybe we start here, we move to, if it's a journey, maybe I'll call it base camp. So here's the first base camp. We take some part of the organization, let's just get predictable. Let's use some lean and agile techniques. We still have some heavyweight stuff. We're estimating earlier than we want to, but we can become predictable. We can learn how to use these agile techniques. We can start changing the culture and the mindset of the organization, and get some good learnings with that first organization that we move. Once we've stabilized there, and the organizational antibodies hasn't killed off that initiative, then maybe we move to base camp 2. Maybe we shift a little bit to the right, or and then maybe after we've stabilized there, we can shift a little bit further over to the right. And while we're working on base camp 3, maybe we start bringing another group into this base camp 1 kind of approach. So we're iterating. Meaning we're going one step at a time with a slice of the organization, and we're incremental in that we're going to take one slice, and then we're going to take another slice of the organization, and then take another slice of the organization. By the way, moving to the right requires improved technical practices. You've got to start thinking about more automated testing, test-driven development. You've got to refactor your code and clean it up. You've got to reduce your technical debt. Improve the technologies. If you've got some stuff that's hard to work with, you may have to replace it. Break dependencies across the organization, and reduce your batch sizes. Reduce the size of your releases. If you're doing with month-long sprints, reduce it to 2-week sprints. Smaller projects, smaller releases, smaller roadmaps, smaller bets. And improve technical practices. And as you go further to the right, base camp 3, it's smaller batches again. You need to streamline the delivery system. You need to introduce DevOps and deliver frequent and high quality releases. Number 4, we're trying to go after more speed and more flexibility, cycle time reduction. Deliver the highest value first, constrain the amount of things that you have in process, And then, of course, there's the lean startup approach where you're testing hypotheses quickly. Yes, sir.
Question, if you have maybe a property or something that you're working with that has a large amount of technical debt, what's a good strategy to get over that hump so you can go agile?
The question was, how do you, if you're dealing with some legacy code or whatever that does have a lot of technical debt, how do you get over that? That's a whole talk in itself. I could certainly recommend Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. I think that's the title of the book. And there's defect-driven testing where if you've got a defect, the first thing you do is write a unit test to demonstrate the defect, and then you fix it. You can start teasing apart. It's hard. Or you can start teasing apart pieces and start introducing testing around anything that's either risky or that changes often. Try to tease apart the dependencies. You may have to rewrite sections. So that's difficult. And that part of the journey takes as long as changing the culture of the organization. It's hugely expensive, but it's absolutely critical if you want to move to the right. So I don't have an easy answer there.
Good.
Thank you. So if you're going to take on this kind of a journey, what does it take to begin that journey? I haven't fully addressed what it takes to start out, so let's go back to the hypothesis for a minute. So my hypothesis is that healthy culture and effective practices only emerge within a rational delivery framework. And I've talked a little bit about what a rational delivery framework looks like. We've got to solve some of the problems, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about what I mean by structure. We need to first define that rational system of delivery, and we need to start breaking dependencies across the organization. Again, I'm alluding to the structure of the organization. So what your organization might look kind of like this. I see people nodding their heads. Yeah, so it's a tangled up mess. You got lots of dependencies, you got some individuals, you got some small teams that manage or that control certain aspects of certain parts of the technologies. And to deliver anything of value, large segments of this rat's nest needs to move in a concerted fashion. They need to move together, and you've got lots of project managers and managers managing all these dependencies and these risks, or at least you would need to have them if you don't in this kind of situation. So this is not the kind of thing that is going to allow Agile to take root and be successful. Now, sure, this team right here, maybe they can use extreme programming or Scrum, and maybe they can start delivering on their dependencies. But as an organization, the whole organization can't become Agile or roll out Agile in a larger scale because of all these dependencies across all of the teams. So when I'm talking about teams, here's what I'm talking about. Certainly, as I alluded to before, when you've got these companies with lots of diverse technology, you're going to have some service teams. You're going to have some group that manages aspects of the COBOL, and you're going to have some. Maybe you have some services that are now in .NET or Java that provide services to other teams. So I'm not saying that, I don't want you to think that I'm saying that you got to take the Agile approach right from the start and change the organization so that you've got one COBOL programmer and one Java programmer and one DBA and one UI guy and then your UX guy all in one team. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is some mix of service teams and feature teams that you need to figure out to have a rational delivery system in your organization. And in every case, it's different. And in every case, it's what you can do first isn't necessarily your end state. So you may need to make several iterations of your organizational structure change as you go. But you're going to have service teams, teams that provide services for multiple feature teams or multiple product teams. And so we need some product teams that are going to integrate these services and write customer-facing features. Both of these types of delivery teams can use Scrum or Extreme Programming. They can be Agile. This product team, it looks more like your prototypical Scrum team because they're delivering real end users, real user stories for real end users, whereas the service teams, their users are other teams in the company. Okay, so we're going to have some mix of that. Now, I don't want you to think I'm proposing something like this. We need a more rational approach and design to our teams, and we do need to have more cross functionality than a lot of organizations are having today. So on top of that, though, so we have these delivery teams, these product teams and services teams, but we also need program teams. Sometimes I call these product owner teams, and what I mean by that is a product owner is a big job in Scrum, and they need help, from testers, and they need help from tech leads or architects, and so we need to give them the technical support that they need, and maybe they need help from a BA. So let's get a tech lead and an architect and a tester, and attach them to a product owner and let them operate as a team to make work ready for these delivery teams. That product owner can't and shouldn't operate in a vacuum. They shouldn't operate alone. They need help. They need help grooming the backlog. And so let me take a little aside here. Is backlog grooming, is that a meeting? It could be, it is for us, is what I heard. I saw somebody shake their head no. No, grooming is an activity that doesn't have to happen in a meeting. If you're pulling your whole team together to groom stories and you're spending a lot of time talking about them and debating the stories and figuring out what they need to be and editing them in Jira, with everybody staring, maybe that's not the most efficient approach. Maybe if you had a product owner team, you assign your tech lead and your tester to your product owner, and maybe they can sit down and groom stories at their desk independently and come together from time to time to talk about them. Then when you bring the whole team together, you've got groomed stories already. And you don't have to have the whole team groom the stories. So don't think that grooming has to happen in a meeting. Okay, so that's a side note. You get that for free. So product owner teams. So product owner teams. I mentioned earlier that we want to align the teams with a business problem or with business value. So these product owners are after delivering some business value. They're aligned with business value. They need to be. And then the teams that they are providing services for need to be aligned with them. You need to keep these teams together. Let them learn how to work together, get beyond forming, storming, and norming on to performing and all that kind of stuff, and have stable teams aligned to solving these business problems. Again, we don't want to align people just because of technology. We want to align people around the business problem. If you're doing matrix management, the product needs to be the strong side of the matrix rather than the technology or the functional manager. Okay, so if you think about this, who's familiar with Conway's Law? You've heard of Conway's Law. It is that, some of you, that the architecture of the system is going to reflect the organizational structure of the organization that built it. So if you think about, I am saying we need to change our team structure. So if I'm saying we're going to change our team structure, it's not going to match the current architecture. I understand that, and it's going to be painful, and it can be difficult, and people are going to wonder, why in the world did we do this? You just made us very inefficient. But we do need to put together cross-functional teams, and we do want to change the architecture. So put teams together around the architecture that you want, and let them start breaking dependencies and breaking pieces off and changing the architecture of the product to be what you want it to be. Again, this is another one of those things that takes a long time, and you need to do it incrementally and iteratively. So you might not start with the ideal end state, but start making steps towards the architecture that you want to have, and to tolerate the pain that's going to come from forming cross-functional teams that don't match your current architecture. And help the organization push through that fear that, oh, now we've got two teams changing this same piece of code, or you've got people that don't know this code having their fingers in it. Well, yes, that's true. But if we're going to change things and move the organization forward, this is something that we have to do. All right, and then so we've got product owner teams and delivery teams, and at the top we've got portfolio teams. So we need to manage our portfolio. We need to have a stream of small projects or a stream of epics moving through the system, and we need to govern that flow of epics through the system. And so we need a portfolio team with a governance model to be involved in that as well. And I end in a few minutes, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So this would be the structure that I'm talking about. We've got product teams, our feature teams that are consuming service teams, and it needs to be such that these teams up here can't inject dependencies down on these service teams. If you have a lot of these higher level teams injecting dependencies down on this team, then this team's going to become a bottleneck. This service team is going to be a bottleneck in your organization. And then everything grinds to a halt. So what you have to do is these product and feature teams need to operate independently. They have to, anything they want to deliver, they can only make plans based on what the service teams have already provided. So they shouldn't make plans on, in this sprint, these two teams have to get together and work together in order for either team to finish their sprint successfully. That's not going to work. You can't do that kind of stuff. So these services teams need to operate, and you may have read about this at Amazon, I think. They have service teams that are treated like independent teams that are out there to add value. They have their own product manager, their own product owner, and they're thinking about their constituents, and they're trying to meet the needs of the people who consume their services. But and these higher level teams can go talk to this team and say, hey, I'm going to need this. I'm going to need this in a couple months or 6 months, or here are my requirements. I'd love for you to build this. But these higher level teams can't force the bottom teams to put things in their sprint plan, or you end up with lots of bottlenecks. All right, so let's see, then we've got product owner teams that support these, and these feature teams or product teams are aligned with the product owner teams, and they're aligned solving business problems. And we have a portfolio at the top that's managing the prioritization of epics and projects through the system. And it certainly makes sense to do Scrum or extreme programming or something like that at the bottom level. It makes sense to govern the flow of features at this middle tier using something like Kanban, and same thing at the top. We use Kanban at the top to manage the flow of epics through the system. All right. And then so the iterative and incremental approach to the transformation is let's take some slice of the organization, top to bottom, and let's start putting these agile and lean principles and practices into place. Let's fix some of the organizational problems and set up the structure so that we can have a Scrum team that operates as I've described. We have feature teams and service teams, and they're not injecting dependencies, and they're aligned around a business problem. And so we move that first slice of the organization to the first base camp, and maybe we then, as we move that slice of the organization to the next base camp, we move it slightly to the right in the journey, then we take another slice of the organization and get them to that first, just move down the hierarchy in that 4 quadrants and just get them predictable. And then we can move on. Maybe we move those 2 slices, you do it in any order you need to, whatever makes sense in your organization. I'm just painting the picture that it's an iterative and incremental approach where you take slices of the organization and move them through a journey of agility. And then take another slice of the organization and go from there. Do I have another slide? Okay, so by focusing on the fundamentals, fixing some of the organizational problems, fixing the structure of your teams, paying attention, breaking some of those dependencies, putting teams in place around the architecture that you wish you had instead of the one that you currently have, we can begin to achieve this true enterprise agility at scale. Now, I certainly don't want anybody to think, oh, this is simple. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm not saying it's canned. Every time you do this, it's different. But using this approach, you can reason about the journey that you need to take, where you need to start in the organization, and start with the structure first approach. Don't think that you can hire me or anybody else to come in and just teach Scrum without having a management consultant come in and fix some of the organizational problems and fix your organizational structure and put these teams in place. Don't think that training is going to be valuable outside of just doing a pilot. What do you think? Yes, sir.
This seems not inconsistent with scaled agile.
Oh, absolutely. So back when I was talking about when we first get to that, the comment for the recording was this seems not inconsistent with scaled agile framework or disciplined agile delivery. Absolutely. When I said that when we first move down the hierarchy to getting predictable, you're absolutely going to have to put in things in place like scaled agile framework or disciplined agile delivery to hold things together. That there is, until you've solved all the dependencies, you've got to have a mechanism. You've got higher coordination costs. You've got to have mechanisms to hold everything together and deliver on those commitments. So absolutely, that first step does not feel agile.
So usually, does the business partner need the agile training as well?
So are you asking, does the business partner need agile training as well? Yes, certainly. So any part of the organization where we're going to try to roll out Agile or Scrum, they certainly need to be educated on what we're trying to do. So if I take a slice of the organization and I'm going to start putting Scrum into place and I'm changing the structure of the organization, there's lots of stakeholders that need to know, hey, we're changing the org structure, and here's why, and here's what you're going to experience in the next 6 months. It's not going to be all easy, and there's going to be some pain, but we have to do a lot of good stakeholder management during the transformation. Yes, sir?
Common question. I like that you mentioned the pilot program. If you're just getting started in Scrum, I've noticed that having a pilot program and showing that success can often motivate the rest of the organization to move in that direction. And then my question is, to you, who is the best person to be your product or your product owner, I guess, of your Scrum team?
Who's the best person to be the product owner for the Scrum team?
Yeah.
You know, I look around the organization. So what do you mean by that? It's Fred. Fred should be your guy.
Okay. I guess the person, the main stakeholder, you have your developers, you have your QA,
Uh-huh.
your VA.
Okay.
But who's
Okay, so where do you get product owners from is kind of the question.
Yeah.
Where do you get a good product owner from? So product owners tend to come out of the business. Often they come out of a product management group. Sometimes they come out of product marketing. Sometimes you might have a business analyst or some kind of subject matter expert that grows up and becomes a product owner. And I've seen people from the field, from tech support or from customer support, step up, and they know so much about the product and about the customer's needs that the time is right for them to provide guidance to the team. So product owners can really come from anywhere, but they need to be available to the team. They need to have a good rapport with the team, be able to spend time with the stakeholders and bring the requirements and have a clear backlog. The product owner, again, is such a big role that they, as I said, that they shouldn't act alone. Sometimes you need a couple. You need a chief product owner and a BA, and then an Uber product owner for big programs. But they need to speak with one voice, and they need to understand the Agile approach that we're trying to do, and they need to understand lean concepts. So I know that was a real fuzzy answer, but they can come from many places. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So if you have everybody else outside of your business, outside of your team, so your delivery team, everybody else is waterfall or something else and has no idea or no wanting to go to Agile, and the only thing you control is within yourself, and I'm assuming you're kind of almost stuck a little bit.
So the question was, if the rest of the company is waterfall and you're trying to go Agile, then you're stuck. Well, if you think about that lower left quadrant, where everybody else in the company, the whole company, the PMO, everything is valuing predictability, and we've got commitments. And all I'm trying to do is take that first team and have change a little bit of the structure, put a product owner team in place, and have some governance. But they can operate quite well in a waterfall group because that management of dependencies is still happening across the whole organization. All of that overhead of dependencies is still there, but we can start getting a team to use lean and agile techniques to deliver on those commitments, to become predictable. So it's actually quite a good match in that left quadrant. Now, if you're saying your agile team wants to be a lean startup, then forget it. You're right. That's not going to work if your agile team is a lean startup kind of a team.
Or the ad hoc where we get requirements in at the drop of a hat and have to turn around in a week. We have to drop everything.
Right. If you're in that up left ad hoc quadrant, you want to move out of there. That's the whole point. And I'm saying that you can't move to the right. You have to move down first and first get predictable.
That's good for us, but we're still unpredictable because everybody, we get dictated what we put out.
I glossed over it, but I included the portfolio team. The portfolio team has to get a handle on that. They've got to start, and so when we put a portfolio team together, it's the CIO and the CEO and the vice presidents are on that team, and we tell them, hey, you've got to stop making 18-month commitments, and we've got to get control over the flow of work. I'm out of time. Thank you, everybody.